One of the biggest stories we continue to follow is the president's national address tonight, where he's expected to make his argument to build a wall along the southern border and his argument about how he'd want to pay for it. The issue is the major sticking point in the government shutdown now on day 18. 11 Alive's political analyst Dr. Andra Gillespie joins us. Usually presidential addresses of this nature are reserved for times of crisis or when the country's in a crossroads. Do you believe we're at that point to see an address like this?
Well, it's not unusual for presidents to try to appeal to the American people, especially at times where he and Congress might disagree on issues. So this became famous in political science when a political scientist observed Ronald Reagan doing it quite often. And so we call this going public. So there are two things that President Trump could do tonight. He could either explain to the American people why he's declaring the border crisis a national emergency, which will allow him to unilaterally allocate funds to the wall, or he's going to try to use this to plead his case in his side so that citizens can put pressure on their members of Congress to actually support the president's initiative and actually fund the wall. So we'll have to see exactly what case he makes tonight, but in either way, what he's trying to do is he's trying to appeal directly to the American people so that they call their members of Congress so that they get support for whatever strategy he's planning on using.
Swaying public opinion in this way. Initially, the TV networks were questioning whether they would air this just yesterday, deciding they would go ahead and do this at 9 o'clock tonight.
Yeah, I mean, this shows that this strategy has evolved since people first started observing it with Ronald Reagan. So the president no longer commands the airwaves in the way that he once did, and so there were concerns about whether or not this would potentially be used for propagandistic purposes. And at the end of the day, because this is a really salient and important national issue, I think the networks decided to weigh in and say that it was important for him to be able to have the outlet to explain to the American people what he's doing and why.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation about will he declare some kind of national emergency which would allow him to allocate military money. We'll have to see if he does that, but we get a lot of questions here at 11 Alive. Can he even do that? Can the president do that to circumvent Congress in that way?
There is a lot of dispute about that. So there is a law that he can use the National Emergencies Act to try to invoke that. We would not be surprised if somebody tried to sue, actually, as a result of this, saying that he is overstepping his bounds. So this is actually really contested in terms of whether or not he could. I mean, we should note that there are lots of national emergencies. In fact, we are currently under a number of different national emergencies. If Congress strenuously disagreed, then one, they could push back by coming out and saying so, but they could also demonstrate that by with super majorities trying to declare that this national emergency is in fact not a national emergency. And in a closely divided Congress in both the House and the Senate, that just seems terribly unlikely, which is why President Trump, may be able to try to proceed. But I would not be surprised if there was a lawsuit afterwards as a result of this.
All right. Well, we saw in the midterms how divided Georgia is over this issue and other things, the country following suit. So it will be very interesting to see the response from tonight. Dr. Andra Gillespie, thanks so much.
Thank you.